Welcome to the National Council on Interpreting for Healthcare's monthly podcast, sponsored by the Standards and Training Committee. This podcast is intended for you, our members, the public at large, and everyone working to promote language access and social justice. Join our conversations with some of the best in our field and hear what they have to say about interpreting for healthcare. My name is Yulia Spirov, and I'm a member of the NCHC Standards and Training Committee. I'm so honored to welcome today's guest, Katharine Allen. Katharine Allen is a community and conference-trained interpreter with over 3 decades of experience interpreting, training, and designing curricula. She is a licensed trainer and co-author for the Indigenous Interpreter, the Community Interpreter International, and the upcoming The Remote Interpreter textbooks and training programs. She worked for 10 years to raise the profile of interpreting as co-president of Interpret America. Katharine is a founding member of the American Association of Interpreting and Translation in Education. Katharine was also the California Healthcare Interpreting Association president for 2 years and served on the CHIA board for 7 years. She recently joined Boostlingo as their language access training specialist. Katharine has an MA in Translation and Interpretation from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Welcome, Katharine.
That's what happens when you've been around forever.
I-
You get these bios that just go on and on. So you too will have this bio. Just stick with what you're doing, Yulia.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Yeah.
And yes, it's amazing. I've been following your career, I think, ever since I joined medical interpreting. And my first introduction to you was the Interpretips videos. I love those, still love them, go back and watch them from time to time. And I quote one of your videos where you say, manage the flow, not the speaker. So I think it's like a mantra, manage the flow, not the speaker.
I always love hearing what people take out of it, especially if I don't remember what I've said. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't have that in my mind, but that's a good. I'll have to remember that I said that. I can reuse it again in trainings.
Absolutely. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, on this podcast, we ask all guests the same 3 questions. And our first question is kind of very broad, and I think you'll have a lot of options to choose from when you think about this. Looking back, what are you most proud of?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I appreciate it. It's always an honor to be asked to speak, and especially, for the heart of my career in community interpreting and medical interpreting. What am I most proud of? I guess I'd have 2 broad things. I think one would be just in general. I came into this profession around 1996, and 7, 8, around in there. And mostly because I was trying to figure out how to get into interpreting. And I went to the ATA. I said, okay, I'm going to go to a conference and figure out, what my field is. And I saw Beverly Truman speaking there from the new, really young organization as the California Healthcare Interpreting Association. Had really not been founded that long before. And then we connected, and she said, well, do you know about your home? Do you know about your, interpreting home in California, the California Healthcare Interpreting Association? And I didn't. I mean, this is all sort of pre-internet and pre-social media. And so I became a member, and then I became, a board member, and then I was served my time as president. But it really means that I've been kind of involved in the healthcare and community interpreting space really since it started ramping up in a serious way. So I just happened to come in, like it just my age just happened to be when I came in. And so I got to be part of all those early efforts and early, days of like getting, I came into CHIA right as the CHIA standards were being published, and then the National Council standards, followed soon thereafter. And I sort of was witness to the tremendous big heavy lift and national, really truly national effort that was. And the conferences started coming along, and we started to get listservs, and we started to get job descriptions inside hospitals, and then it just sort of all ballooned from there. And I think if you had told my young 30-something self when I started, that you would see an entire profession found itself, and in 30 years it would look like it looks now. Um, I don't think I would have believed you, right? Especially based on 40-hour training models and short course trainings and people getting trained at conferences and inside their hospitals and, however they can. It's like if you had told me that all these certificate programs would exist and, that it had started to build out up into academia. I don't know. I think that's one of the things that I'm really proud to have been part of, that I get to be, that I get to claim kind of that as my legacy. You get to get in right at the beginning, and it's just sheer coincidence that I just that was what was happening when I found my interpreting home. So that's one. I don't know if you want me to pause if you have any comments, but that would be the first thing.
I'm just awestruck and fangirling, and that's pretty amazing to witness, the cheer standards. And we talk about them so matter of factly nowadays. There are several documents from, on which our code of ethics and standards of
Yep.
practice are based, and yeah, and they didn't used to exist.
Yeah, they didn't exist. Yeah.
However
Yeah.
however did you do anything?
Well, that was the thing is, it's sort of the way when I, part of fast forward to just kind of right before COVID, when we started the effort to try and pull together an organization around educational interpreting, there's a reason why some of the sort of more veteran healthcare interpreter folks were part of that effort, was because it was very parallel. And it was like, hey, we were part of the initial efforts, and we have something to offer in terms of maybe not completely recreating the wheel, because it's a very similar moment in time. Like it's tipping. It's, in the last 5 years, we've all seen it tip towards it, the educational interpreting side. And it's a very unique setting. It's very different. It's not, there's areas in common and areas where they're not, but it's the same process. It's groups of small people who are fed up, and who have reached levels of expertise because they've been at it by themselves in isolation in their school districts, for 10, 20, 30 years. There's a lot of expertise out there. And now you have the internet and social media, and you can really knit together. It's amazing to me how quickly that's starting to knit together. I think much more quickly than for healthcare interpreting because of the internet and the social media. But I would say the second thing that for me, there's lots of things I'm proud of, but I have to say that I'm very proud of the advocacy work I did with Interpret America. I think, that was this weird organization that Barry Slaughter Olson and I, we set it up as a business, which at the time, people were very critical of, because we didn't want a board, we didn't want a nonprofit. We just actually wanted to run events where we could invite everybody and we could start talking about things. And at the time, even so, that was 2010 through 2011. So right as medical certification was launching, we were launching Interpret America. And the first Interpret America, we had leadership from conference, sign language, medical, legal, some community, all sitting in the room together. And people literally didn't know they each other existed. The heads of the different associations didn't know, the conference interpreting associations didn't know about NCIC or CHIA or IMIA, and vice versa. People, the head of NAGIT didn't really have any connection to any of the medical, much, they're very young in their early days, healthcare interpreting associations. And so, we got to spend 10 years sort of talking about trying to get everyone talking to each other, and then really trying to point to the technology trends that were barreling down upon us. And I just feel very fortunate and blessed by that work as well, because I got to both work as a practitioner at the very, at the practitioner level and the individual interpreter level and in various settings. And then I also got to see, help the conversations happen between the specializations. And so that's work. And then I guess the third thing I would say is that I feel very blessed to have been able to do as much work as I have in Indigenous interpreting spaces as I have. So I think those would be the things I'm proud of, and proud of our profession for tackling.
That's amazing. And
Yep.
I really, what you just told me about various kind of organizations and sections or sectors of interpreting industry kind of not knowing each other exist, and what
Yep.
they're doing. I think as a spoken language interpreter, I feel like in the healthcare interpreting, we don't work enough with sign language interpreters because I think we can learn so much from each other. Or I don't know, I feel like I can learn so much from sign language interpreters. And the fact that we are kind of silent a lot of the time makes me sad, and I want to be friends. And so I want us all to be friends. And so I love that you became, friends with all of the other sectors. That must have been amazing. So how many conferences or meetings did you have altogether? Is it 10 years? About 10 years?
I think we put on 7 summits, and then we also provided content for the Globalization and Localization Association's annual conference, which was such an eye-opener for me because I got to go to a conference on the business side, which most practitioners, we don't ever go to because it's way expensive, right? So unless you're working for one of those companies, you don't go. And so, yeah, we put on a lot of different, and we always called them summits because we wanted them to be more conversations. We, especially as the training conferences grew and proliferated and got so good, we didn't want to replicate that. So it was, I credit that for getting to meet so many people in the profession. And all the while social media is beginning and growing, and everybody's learning how to tweet, and we're learning how to have Facebook pages. And, I think it's been an interesting experience to have that be kind of mid-career, seeing how that impacts some professions and starts to knit connectivity between people. And then I think that for me, one of the things I saw from the pandemic that really struck me was how that just got supercharged. Like a whole lot of interpreters and people who'd never been connected got connected because of the stresses of the pandemic. So it's been a really interesting ride.
I know it has been.
Yeah.
And just, we are right now talking on Zoom across state lines.
Right.
That's the very example of us getting connected. But yeah, I remember those wild days.
Yeah. Skype at the beginning, right? Skype. Right.
I have been known to Skype. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now let's switch to a different question and talk about challenges. Currently, in all of the work you're doing or in any of the industries you're connected to, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
I think there are a lot of challenges, and I might save my biggest challenge for the last question, but I think a lot of the themes that I grew to understand during my time with Interpret America, I think are really bearing fruit, not necessarily in great ways now. And I think one of those themes is, I have gone to work. One of the reasons I went to go to work for Boostlingo, which is a software company that, provides a platform for thousands of remote interpreters, is because of this huge divide between the workforces. Like our profession has somehow the community interpreting profession, and specifically that I'm talking about, the compliance and, service to immigrant and language access side of this profession. We have this incredible workforce at this point of on-site interpreters who've worked their behinds off for 30 years, just like we were talking, like all those really dedicated folks inside hospitals and clinics and schools and everywhere, and in the courtrooms. It's not community interpreting, but legal interpreting is, very parallel in that sense. So you have these, this really seasoned and veteran and just expert on-site interpreters who have fought so hard to create that structure for the profession. And parallel, the entire time that we were doing that on site, companies, vendors, tech vendors, and companies and clients were trying to solve the problem of, well, what do you do with all the other languages that you can't fill on site? And so you had LSPs and technology companies and clients creating a remote interpreting structure inside our profession. And the remote interpreting workforce is just completely separate. Like the people who are hired and brought on and trained and how they're trained, like all that happened in absolute parallel. And so the leadership that's at NCHC and CHIA and IMIA who wrote the standards and wrote the codes and created the training standards were not involved at all in the creation of an entirely parallel workforce, which is actually much larger than our on-site workforce, right? So who trains on-site interpreters? Companies. That's who trains on-site interpreters. And many companies now will, pay for the established training models, and everybody kind of I mean, from what I've seen, especially I get to see a lot of training products from inside companies. Everybody's really, does their best to try and complete that 40 hours, that in terminology and whatnot, but it's completely separate. And so this is the big challenge I see, because on the on-site side, we fought really hard for better wages, for minimum 2 hours, for, mileage, for just like a basic, even if it's maybe lower middle class, but like a living wage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet on this other side, you have a completely commoditized workforce earning per minute wages. And there's just no connectivity, right? It's not represented in the professional associations. We don't have, the remote interpreters division at the ATA. We don't have remote interpreting task force and work groups, for pretty much, we don't have that in any of the professional associations. And yet I would argue it is the majority
It is.
of interpreters. And it has already been, this is people fret about offshoring and the globalization of this workforce. It's already globalized. It's like that it was baked in from the beginning. So this is something that exists. So it's a challenge, right? This is one of the reasons why, for me, the work at going into and working for Boostlingo was so interesting, because it's like, okay, well, this is an area that I feel like needs visibility and light shown on it, and advocacy. So I think that may be one of the biggest. I mean, there's lots and lots of challenges, but as long as there's downward pressure on a commoditized section of our workforce, right? There's downward pressure everywhere, right? So everywhere. So it puts pressure on everyone.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you for, I think you put into words what I've been thinking about for a while. And, I work for a hospital, and we, of course, rely very heavily on our vendors for telephonic and video remote interpreting. And we appreciate them because we have, our hospital has a very robust interpreter services department. We have amazing professional interpreters, but they can't be in, several places at once, nor do we have all of the languages that we see. So I really, really appreciate our vendors that support us. But, I still feel like it's an underappreciated resource. And even in the language, I've seen so many times as an interpreter showing up and providers saying, "Oh, the real interpreter is here. I'm going to, to disconnect." And I'm like, I'm glad that you're glad to see me, but this is also a real interpreter. It is it's a human being. They've also been training. They're also professional, So let's say the in-person interpreter is here.
Right.
They're real.
Well, I think some of the ways to take the heat off, and of course they are, and it's, and I think it's very easy to get focused on the bad players in the field, or the companies that, are putting up undertrained interpreters, and then, they're remote interpreters, are bad interpreters. I think there's a really different way we could look at that. And for me, the issue is that you have a patient, and it could even be a Spanish speaking patient, comes in on a Friday afternoon and gets the on-site interpreter who works on site, has full contextual information for that setting, knows the providers, and can provide what we would hope to be at least a very competent language access encounter. And that patient should have the same encounter at midnight when they need to call the telephonic interpreter, because there's no on-site interpreter working at midnight or on Saturday or Sunday. And so to me, I think one way we can get out of this, sort of prism of, they're not as trained, they're not real. Because I mean, this is such an old story. When I came into medical interpreting, all the legal interpreters were looking down at, community interpreters, like, those aren't real interpreters, and the conference interpreters wouldn't even consider. I mean, this is a generalization. I don't want to speak for everyone, but there was just those kinds of biases and those kind of stereotypes, like, those aren't real interpreters. Those aren't those people working in healthcare. That's not real interpreting, right? And so it's so frustrating to me to see that play out again. Instead, I'd like to see, okay, look, you're asking, you have a globalized workforce and there's no way around that. If you need Ukrainian at midnight in on Saturday in a US hospital, it's going to be sourced probably by an interpreter in Europe, right? I mean, these companies are bringing interpreters in from wherever they can find them. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do you have that patient receive some kind of equivalent language access? And so then if you ask that question, then it becomes how do we support our remote interpreting workforce and, you know, to be able to improve their quality? And it can't just be that they have to pay a lot of out of money pocket because, you know, for on really low salaries. To me, it has to be, we have to get this legislated. This needs to be made explicit. Like if a hospital is, you know, have the remote interpreters also should be paid XYZ, should receive XYZ education, should, you know, right? I mean, all of that's just this huge, gigantic loophole that it's like it fits. So, oh, we're in compliance. We have our telephonic contract, and
Mm-hmm.
that's
Mm-hmm.
great. But there's like the law doesn't even, you know, say to the hospital, fine, but that remote service has to, you know, look like this, like more specificity. What does that actually look like? Because if it becomes, if it's required through legislation, then people will pay for it, right?
Right.
Right. We learned that, like we made the legislation work for us for the on-site interpreting, and I would like us to see the legislation work for us for the remote interpreting side. So anyway, I'm sorry, but I see that as just a really big, you know, very timely and big challenge. And that's obviously where I've got my focus on right now.
Right. Well, I feel like, the textbook that you authored on the remote interpreting
I
will go a long
co-authored,
way.
co-authored.
Co-authored, yes,
Yep,
absolutely co-authored,
yep,
will go a long way
mhm,
towards supporting the remote workforce
yep.
because, because a lot of the training and even the standards of training are focused on in person, right? When we
Yep.
talk about
Yes.
managing the flow and we talk about the positioning,
Right. Yep.
right?
And we're super excited about this textbook because that's what we tackled. We tried to tackle every single one of those topics. How do you adapt ethics? How do you apply protocols? How do you handle all of that? You know, from on a screen or over the phone. So yeah, no, we're excited. And so thank you for bringing up the textbook, but hopefully that's due out in June. That I think that's pretty firm at this point. We'll get the first volume out in June, and then that will be a big resource that will
That's
help.
exciting.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to getting my hands on it and
Yeah.
and reading it.
Good.
Well, I think this ties in nicely with our next question, which is looking forward, what would you love to see happen?
Oh boy. So I'm gonna go for the topic that I think is really right, barely like really on top of us, and that is the artificial intelligence and the technology. I think that this is something that translators, really had their profession flipped 20 years ago, right? And it's taken interpreters didn't because the internet didn't have video or audio quality until the mid 2010s, right? And so we slowly had this slow adaptation of remote interpreting and technology coming in and apps and Google Translate, right? But we've, especially in the community interpreting, we'll just leave it there. um, you know, there's been it's kind of been at the edges, right? For the most part, we've been able to make sure, to fight that fight, like you need to use human interpreting. You can't use Google Translate in a medical encounter, and the law helps protect that. So, but I really think that our grace period is over. And I think
Hmm.
that AI is now fully upon us and is going to be really disruptive and already is being really disruptive. If you're on the conference interpreting side, you have two of the main are remote simultaneous interpreting platforms, Kudo and Interprify, right? Which really built up during the pandemic, have now launched fully AI interpreting options. So with, the ability to use speech to speech machine translation, right? It's like, it's speech to speech for up to 24 languages for use cases I don't know. So, so it's all gets kind of put out as like, well, this needs to be for use cases that aren't diplomatic or where nuance isn't as required, but it really, but there's no guardrails on this. Like nobody has any, it's just like for almost every other profession, it's the tech is way out of ahead of the professions, right? So I think this is, if I could see what I would wish for, I think we have a brief window of time where our organizations could put out some very strong guidelines on use cases and really start defining this, because it's going to get good enough. It's going to be much better than an app, right? It's going to be good enough, already is good enough for lots of kinds of communication. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? There's lots of ways you could expand language access for patients and community interpreters for really straightforward communication where there is currently no language access. I mean, if you think about a patient, they might get an interpreter touching them once or twice a day, and there's a million different smaller, less jeopardy interactions, right? So there's all kinds of use cases. There's use cases where you could really improve even your consecutive interpreting, with with apps like perhaps, I mean, we've been talking about this kind of thing for a long time, but if you're capturing the audio and you're getting real time captions for what someone's saying, you could make your interpreting much more accurate, right? But you could also correct the captions where you're doing it. So as opposed to what everyone's going to rush to, which is like, oh, I don't need the interpreter anymore, because look, I'm getting this great Russian, like I'm listening to the patient, I'm getting this great Russian transcription. That's all I need, right? And I think we're a little bit protected with the language access field because we do have the legislation, and legislation takes a long time to catch up to technology. But I really, if I had one wish, it would be for NCHC, for ATA, for all the, for like actually probably to have some kind of consortium and like an immediate, some kind of just like, we need to be talking about this and putting out use cases. Like, because we never successfully did that for apps. Like, I mean, gradually over time, just through the pressure of on-site interpreting people in the hospitals, we've kind of won the battle, I think, against using Google Translate. It started to creep in, and I think people put guardrails around it. But these guardrails are going to go. I mean, we don't have any guardrails, right? And it's going really fast. So that's my. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I just really want, like, if I could see anything, it would be that our leadership would just go, whoop, we need to pivot and look at this and do something right now, and get some kind of documents and things out there that people can go to and say, well, the NCIC says, here's your appropriate use case in a hospital. Here's your appropriate use case, in education. Here's the appropriate use case in courts, so that we can let it expand access where it's appropriate and safe, but we protect the human encounter, the human interpreted encounter. So that's my big thing.
It is not just big, it is huge. And I don't think it's alarmist at all. I think it's a very justified concern, a very reasonable thing to think about. I think about this daily. Right. And also because it keeps popping up in the news, today I literally read an article about how AI, together with functional MRI, can read continuous human thoughts. Like, if that's not a reason for some sort of alarm, I don't know what is. So I think,
right. And it's going to look like you're going to have this output that, like, you're going to speak to me in Russian or in any language, and the output's going to look legitimate. It's going to look way better than it has. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily accurate. And as we all know, like, the nuance of human context, is everything. And that is still the core unique expertise and skill that we bring, right? And I don't think it's going to be a long time before machines can legitimately, take someone who understands the difference between what a Cuban is saying and what a Mexican is saying, and what a Dominican is saying around the same topic. However, but that's not what. But if we don't get that out there for the clients, we already are this invisible field that clients do not understand the nuance. And why do I have to pay for this? And how come I have to, what do you mean? Like, isn't it okay if she's just bilingual? We're still fighting that battle of how come being bilingual doesn't make an interpreter. Like we're still fighting that battle. And
Mm.
now it's really going to leapfrog really fast. So I just think it, like, to me, it's more like we need a coordinated professional or industry campaign around this. It's not any single player, but it's a lot of players coming out and sort of, hey, this is where this belongs. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to imagine it happening, but that's what I'm going to be contributing to if I can, Yeah.
Okay, sounds like we have
Have our
our
marching
job cut
orders.
out for us. I love this. No, and I think, I think a lot of us have been curious and terrified and alarmed in equal measure,
Yep.
What are some things, how could we harness it for good? How could we make sure it does no harm? How can we sure people don't leapfrog over us on the way
Right.
to use AI in ways that it's not meant to be used?
Right. And right. And it just is so, we just have seen it. If any of you have, I mean, I really do encourage everybody to go and like get your Chat GPT account or whichever one of them and just actually, don't be afraid of it. Start using it and read the articles that are in layman's terms. If you're not, like, I have to absorb all of this as a layperson because I'm not
Mm-hmm.
a tech person that way, right? But I observed it long enough to have some understanding of it, and you just really, and so that it isn't sort of this big boogeyman, but you start to understand, oh, okay, like I understand why this is really going to change everything that has anything to do with writing immediately,
Mm-hmm.
but so but then you look at it and go, yeah, but it was wrong here and wrong here and wrong here. And so you start to realize, okay, here's a good use case for it. Here's not a good use case for it. I mean, we need to do our due diligence. The translation and localization field is doing that due diligence. I mean, you already have news articles where you can go and you can, see like where the output's good, where it's not good. I mean, those companies are bigger. It's a bigger part of the industry. And so they're running those analyses. We don't have that same capacity yet in interpreting. And so it's like we need that research. We need some kind of watchdog body. I don't know. I think we need a watchdog body that's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a professional association. It's more like, hey, we're the consortium of, and we're the ones watching this. So I don't know. I mean, it would be a different kind of structure for our profession, but I do think it's needed.
All right. Well, I hope whoever is watching this episode,
I
you're
know.
hearing Catherine's call to action and you are starting to think who might be part of this consortium and you might just be the person. I mean, I would absolutely volunteer for any such effort because I think you're right,
It's going to take the coalition. It is. I
yeah.
mean, it's going to take a
Mhm.
coalition partly because our profession is everywhere and it's global, right? So that's part of it too. It's like we're everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's always been what the strength and weakness of our profession. So somehow, I don't know. That's what I think about. It kind of keeps me up at night right now. Because we have such a beautiful gift. Like the core for me, and I know that maybe we can end on this note. Like for me, what got me into this field was that absolute magic of when you feel like you have accurately helped people say what they want to say to each other without your voice in the middle. Like there's just something so magical about that skill set because for those of us who practice it, we know how nuanced it's like playing a musical instrument at a high level. Whatever it is, it's just something so empowering and so important and so service based about that, right? And I think that's why most of us get in the field, and it's why I'm still in the field because it's just that core ability to help people connect. And so I want the tech to help us. I don't want it to strip that from us. So
I think it's a beautiful note to end on, although I do not want this to end. So I think you might need to come back, Catherine. It is my honor and my pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming.
oh, thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure always.
Well, thank you. And dear listeners and viewers, join us again next